our first keynote speaker, who's going to help us think broadly about the issue of regions and regionalism, is Susan Smith-Peter from the History Department at CUNY Staten Island. She's Associate Professor and Chair of the History Department there. She's written widely on issues around regional identity, including the really path-breaking 2011 article, Bringing the Provinces into Focus, Subnational Spaces in the Recent Historiography of Russia. That came out in Kritika 12, number 4, or no, the 4th volume in fall of 2011. Please help me welcome Susan Smith-Peter.
So first off, I just want to thank Edith, and I want to thank all the people who have put together this conference. I think that it's really a fantastic thing. Okay, so, and I'm impressed that so many people are here so early in the morning. So I want to thank each of you for coming here and being part of the whole. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the 6 waves of European regionalism, 1830s to 2000s. And what this grew out of is an attempt to try to think about where Russia is in terms of Western Europe. Where is the status of Russian regionalism? And I have to admit, when I began, I just sort of had this general assumption that, perhaps Russia was behind, even though, this is something I've since worked against. But when I started to actually look at the real history of regionalism in Western Europe, I found, to my surprise, that Russia was, for a period of time, not at all behind, but in some cases ahead of Western Europe. And we'll talk more about the moment at which it sort of did actually fall behind later. So there were 6 waves of regionalism in Western Europe and Russia. I'm not going to read through them because we're going to go over each in a slide dedicated to them. I want to just talk a little bit about the spirit in which I am discussing these 6 waves. I don't see this as carved in stone. I don't see this as something that's immutable and immovable. Instead, this is something that developed for me when I was starting to organize my research. I was doing research on basically every publication I could find about regionalism in Western Europe and Russia, and I put it into a timeline. And then in the timeline, I started noticing this strange kind of series of waves in which a particular decade would have all of a sudden a whole bunch of material, a whole bunch of activity would pop up. And it would be in Russia, it would be in Spain, and you'll notice that Spain is very much discussed here. And it could be simply that Spain is better researched than other countries in terms of regionalism, or it could be that just Spain is an especially good comparison to Russia for reasons we'll get into later. So in any case, that's a sense of how I came to this through the process of the timeline. So my argument here, Russia was in line with or ahead of Europe, Western Europe, and the influence of regionalist movements until Stalin. So one of the things I found really striking was really how parallel Russian regionalism, and by Russian regionalism, in a lot of ways I mean Siberian regionalism, but I don't just mean Siberian regionalism, although I think Siberia is the most important of the regions and the most sort of fruitful in terms of action and in terms of thought, because the Siberian regionalists really did have a lot of very interesting things to say about regions. So Russia is, in a sense here, very much together with Europe until Stalin. And I'm going to be talking about each wave as we get to it, but the Stalin era is kind of the whole around which this is organized. And it's very important. Other people obviously need to study it. But it's not going to be something that I'm going to be talking about really beyond saying that that was the moment of the divergence. Okay, so first off, we need to talk about what regionalism is, right? What regionalism is. Regionalism, and I'm going to argue it pretty strongly here, you know, regionalism is really a modern kind of thing. When one reads about regions, of course regions have been around for many, many years, have been around for centuries. But just because something exists in a physical sense does not mean it exists in an intellectual sense, that it exists in a political sense. So regionalism, I argue, is a modern concept, and it has certain goals. It is an idea that one should divide a state into regions in order to achieve cultural or political goals. So we're starting, of course, then with the word state. And I think it's worth thinking about this here. By state, here we mean it could be an empire, it could be a nation state, but in any case, the regions are always being found within this larger body that I'm calling here a state. And of course, regionalism can lead to regions kind of splitting off from states and you know, division of states, but they begin within the state. Cultural regionalism, right? So cultural regionalism, generally speaking, comes before political regionalism. And this is sort of a very, it can seem like a very kind of harmless sort of thing because people are collecting folklore. There are dances that, you know, people collect and then they exhibit. You know, there can be sort of a renaissance of regional architecture. You know, you could have regional museums, and the museums have the narrative of this is the rise of our region. And so it's a way of, cultural regionalism is really about making the region visible, right, in some way or another. Sometimes it can be embodying the region. Let's just think about regional dances, for example. So by regional dances, one can actually see the embodiment of the region. And just to talk about Mexico, nobody thought I would say that next, but last Christmas I went to Mexico. Believe me, I wasn't doing any research. And I went to, in Oaxaca, there's this Golconzeta thing where they have, each region has a particular dance, and they do the dance of that region, and so that symbolizes that region. And so that's an example of cultural regionalism. Right, cultural regionalism, and it also helps to bring together all the different regions. In the particular case of Oaxaca and Mexico, it's also because some regions are exceptionally poor, and it's very important that they have some kind of way to present themselves in a cultural sphere. They also, unfortunately, I wasn't there for that. They have a regional chocolate festival where you can go and you can sample chocolate from every single region, which seems to me kind of the best kind of research I could possibly ever hope to do in regionalism, but unfortunately it wasn't happening while I was there. Right, political regionalism. So this is usually the next stage. Once you've embodied the region, once you've discussed the region, once you've made a narrative about the region in which the region is, let's just say, awakening, coming to consciousness, then the region can be seen as having political goals, and those goals need to be taken into account. So usually this means it could be autonomy, or it could be at lower levels, you know, that there will be a certain structure in which the region will be able to make its needs known. There's many ways that this can be done, but in any case, it usually follows on from cultural regionalism. All right, trajectories of regionalism. So cultural regionalism can lead to political regionalism, but not inevitably. So there are some places where cultural regionalism has not led to political regionalism. And it just remains a very sort of strong force within the cultural sphere. Political regionalism can become peripheral nationalism. So peripheral nationalism is this idea that what had been a region can become a nation, or can attempt to become a nation, or can partly become a nation but not be recognized by the international community. There are a lot of different ways that this could go. A lot of times that transformation happens because the needs expressed at an earlier stage for political regionalism, for let's just say autonomy or something like that, weren't really met. And so therefore it goes to the next stage of peripheral nationalism. But there are other cases where nations became nations without really demanding it, just because of certain events that happened and they became nations, and then they had to go on from there. So in France, France is sort of different. France is a place where cultural regionalism developed into provincialism. So provincialism is something that's kind of interesting, calls for the restoration of former provincial liberties, and was connected with a political right. So in France, the study of the right wing is not as well developed as the study of left-wing politics. And as a result, the study of regionalism and the study of provincialism is not quite as well developed as one would hope. But still, there's interesting material that's coming out from there. And all I can say is that transition does not happen everywhere. From as far as I've been able to see, it just happened in France and not in other places. Okay, so why is Russia important to the history of regionalism? So first off, Russia was the site of one of the earliest examples of political regionalism. And here I'm just sort of hedging my bets. I personally believe it was really the earliest site of political regionalism in Europe, right? In Europe. We'll talk about that later. Social scientists, so I've read a lot about regionalism. And there's arguments about, well, why does regionalism emerge? What is it about regionalism that starts at a particular time and not at another time? What are its origins? And so there's two broad kind of arguments about why regionalism emerges. And this is all stuff that is not taking Russia into account at all. Either that it arises due to democratization and market economies. So this is a very classic sort of, narrative of modernization, progress. It's really an Enlightenment narrative, that with more democratization, there's more of a sense that the regions should have a voice and that people in the region should have a voice, and so therefore there's this kind of straight line from capitalism, democracy, regionalism, and so on and so forth. Now there's another theory, which is basically that regionalism arises due to regional symbols and ideas. So it's this is sort of like the debate over nationalism. I mean, the people who know about the debates over nationalism, this will sound familiar to you. Is it about modernization, or is it about sort of invented traditions? And I think the latter explanation is much more applicable to the Russian case, because when we're talking about Siberian regionalism in 1865, democratization and market economies, I think one would be really hard-pressed to see that as the origins of Siberian regionalism in 1865. But regional symbols and ideas and a sense of Siberian identity is something that actually makes sense, and one can trace and connect these things. All right, the history of regionalism as a term. So to me, this is one of the big clues that this is a modern thing, that this is different from things that had been happening in the Middle Ages and even before, and classical era. This is something different. So the term regionalism in English was not introduced before the 1880s. And interestingly, it was first introduced in Britain. I think it was a Manchester Guardian said something like the unfortunate regionalism of Italy. Right? So it was so it was originally kind of created as this term of kind of looking down upon. Now, in Russian, the related term was local patriotism, and that was in the 1830s. So that, again, this term begins just at the very moment of that first wave. Then Siberian patriotism in the 1860s, and then regionalism, oblastnichestvo, that dates the 1880s when the Siberian regionalists began to use it. So we can see here a kind of movement from sort of saying, well, there's patriotism, and we can have that for the empire, but we can also have it for our own place, and then sort of more of an embrace of the Siberian nature of it, and then this concept of oblastnichestvo, the sense of there's a region, it's regionalism, and the term. So you can see, again, the term in English and in Russian is in the same decade. All right. The first wave, 1830s. So this is cultural regionalism. Cultural regionalism both in Western Europe and in Russia. Influence of Romanticism. So Romanticism, of course, is a reaction against Enlightenment. And I actually have an article that just came out in Region, which is about Enlightenment regionalism. In the sense that in the 18th century, I look at Siberian and Siberian periodicals and one periodical that came in Yaroslavl, and I argue that in the late 18th century there was an attempt to sort of erase the region and replace it with a completely new sort of transformed, transfigured kind of space. So that was the Enlightenment attitude towards the region, that it was nothing, that it was a blank, that it needed to be kind of not seen as anything. But in the 1830s, of course, with Romanticism, there's a sense, well, this is authentic. I mean, these are the real thing. I mean, these are like peasants and huts and, lubki and, the carved things and lacquer boxes. And, this is great stuff. So the region is more authentic. And statistics, I know when people think about statistics, they usually don't think about Romanticism, but let me assure you that statistics used to be very romantic, and I mean that with a capital R, of course. It was a way to describe the world. It was really a qualitative sort of science. It was a way of describing. One could be a statistician, and really what that meant was that you were an essayist that used a couple numbers here, like the population. You might throw in the population, but you would really be writing this sort of essay about this region, about this place, and there were these statistical societies that I'll be talking about in the next slide. There were also the rise of local history societies. Now, of course, the first local history society was in Arkhangelsk, by the way, in 1756. I mention that because that, of course, is before the founding of the Free Economic Society. I always like to get in a plug to Arkhangelsk. I won't be talking much about the Russian North, but I should note that the Russian North, along with Siberia, is one of the two really major kind of, regions with long histories of identity. Okay, so we're still in the first wave. So let's talk about local history societies. By local history societies, I'm including the statistical committees because I've already explained that this was not really a heavily quantitative thing. Okay, committees of historical work established by the French government in 1834 to study the provinces. Provincial statistical committees established by the Russian government in 1834. Hopefully that date sounds familiar, to study the provinces. The Royal Statistical Society is established in London in 1834. All right? You all have advanced degrees. I'm sure you can see what's similar in these statements without my belaboring the point. And the Historical Monuments Commissions established 1844 by the Spanish government. So what all these things are doing is they are all studying their provinces, right? So in France, for example, Brittany, could be studying. There would be this committee of historical work of Brittany, and they would go out and they would study those prehistoric monuments. They could describe things. There would be surveys, the Spanish ones, so like Catalonia. We'll be hearing about Catalonia more in the future. You know, there's a historical monuments commission in Catalonia, and they are gathering material about Catalonia to talk about why it's important. And also in Russia, all these provinces, in European Russia, right? So Siberia is left out, and I mean, Siberia is left out of this whole 1830s wave, and I think because they didn't want to encourage the development of any more local identity than already existed. But that they were to go and do very similar things, very, very similar to the French and the Spanish. Okay, the second wave. All right, so Siberian regionalism. It argued for the political independence of Siberia from Russia. It was strikingly in advance of similar movements in Western Europe. So in 1865, and I like to cite this just so we can have the evidence there, in the proclamation to Siberian patriots, here again, patriotism, had stated, remember that Siberia may be the first Slavic nation to achieve a great popular deed, a democratic republic, long live the Republic of the United States of Siberia. The United States of Siberia, that would be an amazing book title. But in any case, in this affair of the Siberian separatists, that followed, the leaders of the group were put on trial and exiled away from Siberia. You know, so to Arkhangelsk, right? The site of the first local historical society, right? So other people are experts on Siberian regionalism. This is not, you know, my field of specialization, but at the same time, when one has evidence, one needs to present it. Okay, so Western Europe was behind Siberia. Let me just read that again. Western Europe was behind Siberia, right? So Western Europe in the 1860s had movements that were just cultural regionalism. So in 1865, again, interesting, right? In France, the Nantes program argued that decentralization of powers to the regions would avoid revolution. And they wanted to avoid revolution because they were already going in this more right-wing sort of way. In the 1860s, a rise in public festivals in Catalonia, Galicia, and then Germany's raised an awareness of cultural regionalism. So these kind of festivals are sort of like what I was talking about with Mexico. The festivals are celebrating the regions, they're celebrating the kind of unique aspects of the region. It's a way to sort of feel proud of being Catalan. Siberia, and then I thought, you know, I'm Charlottesville, so let's try not to just deny the Civil War. So Siberia and the American South had strong programs for political autonomy of regions, although of course the latter went further. I'm not going to go into details about that. Still, it's something interesting. It's something to think about, this kind of parallel. Okay, the third wave, the 1890s. In this decade, political regionalism came into its own, creation of political regionalist movements with mass support. So this is really the moment where you start to get sort of more of a mass base. Because I have to admit, the Siberian separatists of the 1860s, I think they're fascinating, but at the same time, I would be hard-pressed to say that they had a mass following. But in Catalonia, for example, the Liga de Catalunya, established in 1887, calls economic and political devolution to the region. Regionalist leagues formed in the Basque Country. In France, several regionalist parties had success. In the 1890s, even in the UK, regionalism was seen more favorably. And you'll note that I'm not really talking that much about the UK here. To tell you the truth, I'm not sure. Part of the problem is there's so much research about the UK, and it's so fragmented. I mean, if you wanted to learn about wool trade and, you know, Gloucestershire in the 18th century, you're in luck. But if you want an overall sort of history of regions, well, if anybody knows of one, believe me, I would be so happy. But in general, that statement that I mentioned before of the unfortunate regionalism of Italy kind of seems to be a sense in the UK, yes, there's regions, but we already have this kind of representation, and so we don't need to take it that far. So really, it's Spain and France that we talk about most when we're talking about regionalism here. So in the 1890s, also, Siberian regionalism at its height of influence. It couldn't form a political party, but there's definitely more of a following. Okay, the 1920s, the regionalist feast. And this is an amazing time. The 1920s, I mean, if you want to study a time where it's just the sources are so rich and exciting, both theory and practice, the 1920s is really it. So I think, personally, that this increased political regionalism came out of World War I. A lot of changes happened from World War I. And one of the things that, when I was doing the research, I was really struck by were these parallel developments in Siberia and Spain. And you can look through it here. 1917, Regional Council in Tomsk. 1918, Siberian Regional Duma. June 1918, West Siberian Commissariat proclaimed Siberia independent. 1920, Bolsheviks reestablished control over Siberia. And then we have 1917 to 1919, Catalan autonomy campaign. 1919, Spanish army crushes regionalist claims in Catalonia and other regions. So we have this kind of parallel movement of attempting, in this moment after this huge societal shock of World War I, attempting to create more of a space for the regions. And Catalonia and Siberia seem to be the most, I don't want to say advanced, but let's just say the most elaborated kind of statements and ideas. Okay. Cultural regionalism. So once political regionalism is, you know, not always on the table for each country, cultural regionalism really flourishes in the 1920s. And the Academy of Sciences in Russia really encourages the development of a scholarly network in the provinces. And you know, I should just talk a little bit about the Academy of Sciences. You know, the Academy of Sciences in Russia has been so important to the development of regionalism, or the idea of regions. Remember Arkhangelsk in 1759, the local history society? That came out as a response to a Lomonosov questionnaire. So from the very beginning of this kind of engagement, once you're moving away from 17th century regional chronicles and you're moving towards a more, I don't want to call it modern, but let's just for now call it modern historiography, the Academy of Sciences is very important and is there from the very beginning. But in the 1920s, this is kind of the Academy of Sciences just kind of moment in the sun, because the scholarly network that they create, the theory, the practice, the publications that come out of this time, it's really amazing. And as I say, very sophisticated scholarly work. And in Spain, you have these centers for the studies of regions, Galicia, Asturias, Extremadura, and of course, Stalin and Franco crushed regionalism as a movement from the 1930s. So again, we see up to this point, Siberia and Spain are very parallel, right? The great divergence. Again, I'm not going to be talking about the Stalin era. When you look at the history and you're comparing Russia and Western Europe in terms of regionalism, it becomes very clear that the Stalin era must have been a huge turning point. Because before it, Russia was in step or ahead of Western Europe, and then after Stalin, Russian regionalism was reduced to the level of the 1830s. So that's, I mean, in both Russia and Western Europe, of course, wasn't influenced by Stalin. But in terms of Russia became, we'll be talking about the wave after Stalin, and there was such a wave in the Soviet Union at the time. But while Western Europe had kind of gone on a more political trajectory in the Soviet Union, it was quite different. So the 1970s, and you'll note that here's a gap, here's a big gap. Those earlier waves are about 30 years apart, but I hypothesize that it's really World War II that put this big displacement, because probably, I mean, if things were just going normally, it would have probably been in the 1950s, but, you know, with the trauma and the displacement of World War II, it just pushed everything off for a while. So now in the 1970s, when we're talking about Western Europe, all sorts of interesting things starts to happen. Really a big rise in cultural and political regionalisms. Nations are cutting off subsidies to underperforming regions, while the European communities, forerunner of EU, call for devolution of powers to regions. And in Western Europe, a lot of people have written about this. What was going on here was basically that the European communities wanted to build a sense of being European at a level other than the nation state. And that level, it seems, has been chosen was the region. And of course, this is not, you know, these are not my arguments. I'm working off the work of other scholars here. So the European communities are supporting a massive wave of regional institutional buildings, build up support for integration, different level from the nation. Right? So the idea is, you know, if the nation is resisting integration, let's go to the regional level. 1970s in Spain, regionalist parties gained strength. 1978, Spanish Constitution defines Spain as a state of autonomous communities and gives real administrative and legislative autonomy. In the 1980s, this idea of a Europe of the regions was widespread. You know, there were conferences and various publications and so on and so forth. 1991, Treaty of Maastricht serves as the basis of European Union. And very importantly here, upholds subsidiarity, or that decisions be made as close to affected area as possible. So what that means is, let's say a region feels that it's not being taken, you know, account of, it could take its case to the European Union, and from the European Union's point of view, that's useful because it's helping to build kind of coming together at this lower level. Okay, so cultural regionalism in the USSR is returned to the 1830s level. So no political aspirations of regions. And the most important institution was the All-Russian Society for the Preservation of Historic and Cultural Monuments, VUPIC. It was established in 1965. So very important institution here, serves as a focal point for the work of provincial intellectuals. It could be co-opted by regional authorities. And really, it's striking to me how parallel it is with the provincial statistical committees of the 1830s. It encourages the study of regions. A lot of times it's the same sort of thing, you know, the study of the architectural heritage, of, you know, folk art, of, you know, estates that have remained, you know, landed estates, publishes the works, and so it also lacks political power. But it is an important kind of focal point, and it does serve as kind of a networking point. So then we're just sort of jumping ahead to the sixth wave today. Now, I'm going to just admit right off that the history of the president is not my thing, so it's very possible that this will have to be heavily revised. I just thought it was sort of interesting that, you know, recently regional identity and political regionalism have become very prominent. And there's a sort of blurred line between political regionalism and peripheral nationalism. It's kind of like this is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, if you're a nationalist, you're going to say it's, you know, peripheral nationalism. If you don't feel that country, that region should be independent, you could say it's more political regionalism. Referendum on independence in Scotland, 2014. Again, one could say it's okay, it's peripheral nationalism, but at the same time, they didn't become a separate nation, right? So then is it regionalism? I don't have the answer, but it's something to think about. Crimea, 2014. I mean, note that the claims of regional autonomy, regional difference, specificity become extremely important in this whole political space that we're working in. Ukraine today, so this idea of, you know, Eastern Ukraine is a specific region and it needs to have autonomy, or is it going to be a separate thing? Again, this whole kind of unclear space where you know, there's a lot of different ways, and I'm not trying to put forward and say that this is the only way to look at it. I'm just saying that this is one way to think about it, so it really strikes me that this regional autonomy and regions, the sense of needing to have kind of a political voice for the regions is really becoming much more prominent. Sometimes not always with perhaps the best of intents, but at the same time, in terms of claims, in terms of political claims, I think it's very striking that this political claim is as successful and as widely used as it is today. So we can see that this whole journey that we've been on from the 1830s to the present is still very much unfolding, and it's something that will, of course, continue to unfold, and I hope to be able to talk to you about it. So thank you. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
George Crafts, UVA Library. I'd be interested to have your thoughts on how people in a region speaking a different language or a different dialect would influence their sense of identity.
Mm-hmm. That is a fantastic question. Fantastic question. Of course, in Catalonia, they speak Catalan. So Catalan has become this really important kind of focal point for a sense of regional identity, and it's become this sort of place to organize around. At the same time, people who have argued mainly from the case study of Spain have sometimes said, well, that's one of the things you need to have for regionalism. But I think it's one thing that you can have for regionalism, but I don't think it's required. But it certainly strengthens your case because, you know, of course, Catalonia, one of the things they do is they have these festivals of Catalan poetry. Right? So people read the poetry, and it becomes this kind of celebration of culture, and the very language in which it's spoken is an assertion of separateness. So yes, it's very important. I think it's you know, one of these things where it's sufficient, but it's not necessary. Is where I come down. Uh-huh.
Thank you, Michael. Alan Lynch, University of Virginia. One thought about the British case. Probably you could argue with the 1890s, the single most important issue in British politics was Home Rule for Ireland. It informs almost every issue of domestic and foreign policy. So I think that's one way of broadening the comparison there, all right? And maybe of finding some kind of integration or angle of inquiry into this, all right? And so that connects to the second main point, which really concerns this intersection of ethnicity, region, and language. There's another dimension to this, which goes beyond the dimension of the state-nation or the nation-state and regions within the context of that metropole. There's an ideological dimension to it. There's the whole discussion, for example, amongst the Austro-Marxists about how do you deal with ethnicity and region in the context of an eventual socialist state, right? Where class, not region, not ethnicity is supposed to be dominant. It's a huge fermentation of creative thought about nation, ethnicity, polity, class, socialism, and so forth. And of course, it has an enormous spillover in the case of the Russian Social Democrats as well. So that's one point. The second, about Stalin. There's another way of looking at Stalin. In terms of ethnicity and federalism. Yes, Stalin lost the battle with Lenin over the design of the Soviet state. He wanted a unitary state, formally unitary, versus the ethno-federal polity that was eventually adopted in the USSR. And you're undoubtedly right. The Stalin period is the acme of centripetal power, right? Relatively speaking. At the same time, he did not reverse it, right? That structure was kept in place. And there were significant concessions even in the Stalin period, right, in terms of the forms of instruction, local cultural autonomy in many parts of the country. which survived into the post-Stalin period and became enormous incubators of regional identity of one form or another. One finding that one of my doctoral students came up with, looking at the propensity to regional conflict in post-Soviet spaces, is a remarkable correlation. The tendencies toward ethnically defined nationalism and propensity to violent conflict is strongest where you have well-developed humanities disciplines in the regional universities, all right, as opposed to technical universities, all right, in Moldova, in the Caucasus, and elsewhere. So anyway, just a few thoughts for other contextuals.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it with home rule. I had never really thought about it. I guess that shows that I had never really conceived of Ireland as a region. I always just thought of it as a nation. But of course, one could, in the context of the time, think about it as a region. I don't know if there are any Irish people here. I don't know, but in any case, yeah, it seems a little odd to say that, but at the same time, within the context of the 1890s, that's actually would make a lot of sense. And then the political regionalism defined within the terms of the people at the time, home rule would fit, and that would actually, you're right, would really flesh out that part for the 1890s. And of course, there's massive amount of material on that. Ethnicity, ethnicity, of course, is one of those slippery things. The Siberian regionalists talked about how there was this ethnicity of the Sibiryak, who was mixed population and therefore better suited for Siberian realia. At the same time, it's not really as kind of defined as, let's just say, a Ukrainian sense, although of course there are many people who say Ukrainian ethnicity is not well defined. Let's try not to get into that discussion right now. But it's one of these things that's kind of like with the language. If you have a case study where ethnicity is very important, then you can say, well, ethnicity is a key sort of thing. But like language, I feel that it's again, it's one of these things. It's sufficient, but it's not necessary. Because regionalism can also go down to a much smaller level where. To say, let's just say Galicia in Spain, is someone really going to say that Galicia is a separate ethnicity? I mean, it gets a little bit complicated. I mean, Catalan, there might be people who would say it, but it's a little bit, I think it would be a little bit harder. So it's one of these situations where it can play a role, but I don't think it's a necessary aspect to the whole thing. And I agree that in terms of framework, in terms of what kind of what ethnofederalism and all of that, it's true Stalin didn't get rid of the framework, but he did get rid of most of the intellectuals. So in the 1930s, the academic affair, Akademicheskое дело, many of the most important people in the 1920s regionalist feast were shot. So naturally that stopped their scholarly output. So yes, one can have a structure. But does that structure mean that it generates an identity? I'm not sure. I think there needs to be also a group of intellectuals who are arguing for that identity. And of course, then the structure later on can be repurposed and reused, and it can then give money to various like VUPIC type things. But by itself, I don't see it as capable of generating these sort of effects, identity effects. But anyway, good question, though.
Yuri Urbanovich, University of Virginia. My question is, don't you think that the Bolshevik Revolution, October Revolution of 1917, to a certain degree contributed to regionalism based on political views? Because if you look, I mean, you know, how many different regional entities were established, you know, throughout the former you know, Russian Empire, I mean, it is inconceivable, I mean. And the best probably example would be the desire to establish, you know, the Cossack Republic in the south. Because, you know, Cossacks were virulent, you know, anti-Bolshevik and very loyal to Tsar. And for them, it was very important, so to say, to have, you know, certain distinction, I mean, between what was going on in Russia, in Russian traditional political centers, I mean, you know, and in the south. So my impression is that October Revolution gave push, I mean, for the better or for the worse, I mean, you know, to regionalism based on political views. Would you agree with this approach?
I actually would. I would agree with that. And that's part of the reason why I'm emphasizing Stalin and not Bolshevism per se. Because in the 1920s, the Bolsheviks are in charge. I mean, you know, it's the USSR. And they are giving money to the Academy of Sciences. I mean, the Academy of Sciences is not a sub rosa organization. I mean, they are encouraging this development. There's this sense that if you can't have an international revolution, let's sort of have this revolution, you know, this sort of bring socialism to all the different peoples, and in order to do that, you need to understand those peoples, and you need to encourage the development of studying of the regions. So yes, I do think that it did. They were very much against political regionalism, but in the sense of any sort of aspiration towards independence. But it's true that they did give you know, some substantial autonomy to certain regions. And cultural regionalism, I mean, in a lot of ways, the 1920s were the golden era of cultural regionalism in Russia. And I mean, for the whole period, I mean, just amazing stuff came out, really kind of cutting edge work, fascinating materials about exhibitions, and really interesting stuff going on at museums. Local journals were publishing that just had fascinating stuff. So yes, absolutely. I think that Bolshevism per se, and later, well, I don't know. It depends on how, if you see parallels with Stalinism and communism. But let's just say Bolshevism per se was not innately hostile to regionalism. I would agree. Okay, I guess. Yeah.
I'd like to encourage you to talk a little bit more about the Siberiak case and the issues involved in that, the Siberian regionalism that had gone so far so early, and maybe a little bit about bringing it up to present day since it's coming back. Thanks.
Just now. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. Sure. I think that Siberian regionalism too often has been seen, unfortunately, as peripheral, in not just a geographical, but in other ways. But I think when one looks at it in this context, one realizes this is really important to the history of Europe. And a lot of the thinking that was going on by the regionalists is very important. Like this whole idea of the Siberiak. It's fascinating because it's, in a way, it's sort of a way out. It's a way out of this post-German Romanticism idea of the nation being defined by a people, a Volk, right? Because the Siberiak, the idea there is that you have peoples that are coming together and that it's not an affixed and defined sort of thing. It's more something that has developed on the ground. It's seen as a very positive thing. It's a kind of adaptation to circumstances. And personally, I think it's something that at a methodological level that should be discussed and written about. And I mean, as far as today, I think you're the person who should talk about the update, because you could say a lot more than I could about the resurgence of Siberian regionalism today. I mean, I did say that the history of the present is not. I mean, I'm really based in the 1830s, but I do know that Siberian regionalism today is very important. So actually, I just published an article in Region, the most recent issue of Region, on the 18th century version of Siberian sort of anti-regionalism. But before that, I published an article in Sibirskие исторические исследования, where I'm talking about the origins of a sort of Siberian identity coming out of the late 17th, early 18th century with Semyon Remezov. You've probably heard of him. He's the builder and did chronologies, chronicles, a map maker, a very important person. He felt that Siberia was the New Jerusalem, particularly, I should say, Tobolsk was the center of the world. I mean, no, not the center of the universe, right? And the New Jerusalem. Valerie Kivelson has written about this. And so he argued that, well, he in his map has this map of Tobolsk, literally is the center of the world with concentric circles going out around it. And Moscow is nowhere to be seen. And so there's just this sense that here's the New Jerusalem. It's a place that's specially touched by God. It has everything that humanity could possibly need. And then there's this, I'm almost not even 100% sure if I should mention it, but there's this possibility that Gagarin, who was the governor of Siberia at this time under Peter the Great, might, right? This is not proven, have talked to the Swedes about possibly allying with them and to, attack Russia from the east as well as from the north. In any case, Gagarin was killed after terrible torture, torture that was much worse than was the case for other people. He was, of course, arrested for corruption, naturally. And all of the Remezov had been building a sort of triumphal gate in Tobolsk, which had been in the tradition of Jerusalem, the entry into Jerusalem, and that was all stopped. That was all stopped because Peter the Great stopped funding it. And of course, before that, we get into the regional chronicles. Regional chronicles are very important because they talk about, the history of Siberia from the beginning of time, and the kind of historiography is very much about, puts Siberia again in the center. Now, the Russian North also had a very similar tradition. They had regional chronicles, and it's interesting because these regional chronicles continued up until the 1830s, the very moment of the first wave. So you see a moment of this tradition that coming out of, there was a break in the chronicle tradition. First there was the chronicles that we all know way back. And then there was a reinvigoration of the chronicle tradition in the 17th century. Right? So these chronicles of the 17th century are not exactly the same as, like chronicles from way back. And then they went up to the 1830s. And Yaroslavl, for example, had a very strong chronicle tradition of the 17th century to the 1830s. So sometimes you'll have this situation where someone was both a chronicler and a contributor to the Gubernsky Vedomosti, which is a strange, conjunction of times. So. Mm-hmm.
I'm Victoria Donovan from the University of St Andrews. I had 2 points actually that I wanted to raise. The first builds on the point made by the last person about the agents involved in this kind of regional patriotism. And I think likewise, I'm a bit unclear on how you're distinguishing here between cultural regionalism and political regionalism. Are you seeing one of these as some sort of grassroots movement which is being driven by an indigenous cultural elite, and the other is something that's imposed by a political elite at a centre, whatever that centre is, a centre of a state, on a region? Because I think that's important. And so the point I wanted to kind of tease out was the question of these actors who are involved in the regeneration of regional patriotism, because I think very often what you find are regional elites who are stimulated in some way by other factors. For example, the period that I've written on is the post-Stalin era, when you have, for example, regional identity being affirmed in a very active sense by quite prominent and very active mediators between the centre and the region. People like, for example, Dmitry Likhachov, who was writing about the region of the Russian Northwest as early as sort of all through his career, but as early as the 1950s in a very instrumental way to try and encourage a kind of emergence of a renewal of the Krayevidение tradition. So I want to ask you about that, the importance of indigenous elites versus mediators between the centre and the region for these various periods that you're talking about. And if you see there a difference between what was going on in terms of the emergence of moments of cultural patriotism, cultural regionalism as opposed to political regionalism. The other point I wanted to make just concerned your remark about the 1970s and how regionalism there emerged. And you saying that it emerged, in your opinion, quite late, not without this, later than this normal 30-year cycle that you've identified. I don't know whether I'd necessarily agree with that completely, because I think as early again as the late 1950s, early 1960s, you can see definitely an emergence of regionalism as a kind of ideological idea formulated, for example, most importantly by Khrushchev, with the formations of the regional economic councils, the Sovnarkozy, in 1957. So that was a very important initiative to decentralize political control to the regions, albeit not one that didn't last very long. And then, of course, you have and again, this is something that I've worked on, and I'd be happy to chat with you more about, a reaffirmation of the Krayevidение tradition as early as the 1950s. So Krayevidение being taught in schools and in museums. So that's it.
So yeah, I think it's very important, this question of who is doing this, and I appreciate that, because that didn't really come out in this. So who is doing it? I would call them provincial intellectuals. In the 1830s, they're really sons of priests, profoundly, mainly. But, they come from various, usually not nobles. Occasionally they are. But these are provincial intellectuals whose claim to speak to the state is that they have knowledge of the local. Otherwise, they don't really have a reason to be speaking to the state. The main mediator, I find, is often the Academy of Sciences. Right? So the Academy of Sciences is so important for the history of Krayevidение. It really is. And I think that this is a way in which the center has encouraged the development of regionalism. I mean, if you look at the 1830s, the center needed information about the region, so they created the statistical committees and also the provincial newspaper, Vedomosti, which I didn't talk about here at all, but I could have at great length, believe me. So they were creating a forum for these people who had not that much social cachet to take a public stand, to speak to the state. And then that kind of develops over time And then, in the 1920s, again, you have this provincial intelligentsia. And I mean, thank God for the provincial intelligentsia, because, I mean, without them, so much of the patrimony of Russia would have been lost. And so that is really, the core from the 1920s on. I don't really see so much a continuation, although there might have been, but certainly in the 1920s is the moment where there's a provincial intelligentsia, and then it moves on. But there's always an interaction, and oftentimes it's through the Academy of Sciences.
Okay, I think we'll call it quits for now. Let's thank our speakers.
Thank you. Thanks for the great questions.